to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Well, welcome to Talent Optimization with Tracy Shirk. Today we're talking about gratitude, and I have with me a fantastic guest in Quint Studer. And Quint has done some amazing things throughout his career and life with bringing gratitude to many different areas of his work. Quint, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Tracy. I'm thrilled to be here.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how so much of your success has come from how you bring forward gratitude in everything that you do?
Sure. Well, I think, probably you're good at stuff when you're not good at it. I've always found that people that sometimes become experts on things do so because they weren't experts. So this is not something that came naturally to me, let's say gratitude. But, I started off as a teacher and, purpose worthwhile, making a difference. And then due to my own sort of crash, I ended up dealing with alcoholism. So I'm in my 39th year of sobriety. And, if you're in a recovery program, gratitude plays a huge part in that. And I work with, on volunteer basis over the years, I've worked with men that are suicidal. And one of the things we find that helps them is every day talking about something I'm grateful for. So I, got into healthcare through behavioral health, ended up being president of a large hospital in Florida, started my own company that grew to 250 employees, sold that. And while I was doing that, I got very involved in helping our own community where I live, Pensacola, become a little bit more vibrant. But so it just happens that then with this pandemic and with what I've been doing, just creating tools and techniques for people to take better care of themselves. Because we're in a period where there's withdrawals. And I've always been a big reader. If you look at the 7 Essential Habits of Highly Effective People, the author talks an awful lot about Stephen Covey, deceased now, but he talks about we have an emotional bank account and it's either getting deposits or withdrawals. And life gets withdrawals even in normal times. And now in the pandemic, there's been so many more withdrawals. So if we don't replenish ourselves, we sort of run out of things. We run out of hope. We run out of energy. We run out of enthusiasm. And when you run out of those things, it's really dangerous. So I've really focused a lot on not ignoring the pandemic, but talking about helping people replenish themselves in companies, which I do most of my work with, themselves, their teams, and their organizations. And one of the challenges we have is the primary replenishers also need replenishing right now. So usually, the boss is in charge of replenishing. Somebody told me counselors need replenishing. So the therapists who are supposed to be helping people replenish need their own replenishment. So I've really been focusing an awful lot on how do you create cultures that do that type of replenishing.
Right. And when you look at those replenishers, I love that you brought this up because, what we look at when we're talking about our middle managers in the organizations that we work with is they're the ones that's batteries are drained the most. We're seeing this in healthcare. My husband's a respiratory therapist, right? We're seeing these in all these different places. And I know you talk a lot about those replenishers. So I'm curious, how are you kind of coaching people and what are those replenishers you're bringing, especially for those middle managers?
Well, my love is for middle managers. I was one of those healthcare people that got promoted from within with no training, no development. And I'm sure all industries are probably guilty to this somewhat, but healthcare has always been, in my mind, behind and lags behind on training and developing managers. And I tell people, you're only as healthy as your middle management team. I remember sitting in New York, a venture capital firm had me sit down with a startup company of 180 employees, and I met with the top 4 or 5 executives. And I asked them, how many people reported to them? And we went around the room and they'd say 5 or 6. We got all done. It was about 30. So I said, so those 30 people, the other 150 people in this company report to those 30. They don't report to you. So this company is going to be either going to grow or not grow based on how good those 30 are. So how much
Right.
in development are you given those 30? So I've always been a big believer that you're only as strong as your middle management team. And that means the middle management team has to be developed. So I think when you look at how do you replenish a middle management team, number one is investing in them. And it's pretty interesting because what's happened always, we underinvested in middle managers. We might bring in a speaker once in a while. And what happens is now with the pandemic, it's even gotten worse because we have a reason to not invest. We're too busy. They need to be up on the units. I spoke last week in Evansville, Indiana. And I spoke, and it was some of the first time these healthcare leaders had been together in a long time. And one of my presentations is we're so busy working in our job, we don't get to work on our job. And so I think number one thing you can do for middle managers is invest in them and really talk about, I was on the curriculum committee of the Harvard Business School. So what skills do I need as a leader to be successful? Because I want to be successful. Teach me how to hire better. Teach me how to communicate, including positive conversations and sometimes constructive conversations. Help me with process improvement because I'm getting less resources. So how do I make work with the resources I have? Help me making sure I have good retention strategies and how to retain talent. Help me in the area of customer service. So we find that middle managers are so appreciative. It's almost like taking a plant that hasn't been watered. When you start giving them training and development, they just start blooming. Now, the hard technique of that, Tracy, is the people they report to have to do the same training. Because you can tell a middle manager and train a middle manager, but if they walk out and their boss is not role modeling what they're supposed to be doing, then again, you're taking another withdrawal. So I think training and development is the number one replenisher for middle managers. I think having empathy, I joke, your husband's a respiratory therapist, and I think he'll catch this. I tell the fact that probably one of the hardest jobs in all of healthcare is being a manager on a med surg unit in a hospital. It's got the most patients, the most diversity of illnesses, diseases, and the nurses are many times your newer nurses. When they get really trained, they go to ICU or ED. And I'll tell CEOs, if you ever get depressed, just go up on the nursing unit and pretend you're the manager of the med surg unit, and you'll be down in about 10 minutes, more appreciative. So I think investment is important. I think helping remove barriers, because sometimes the middle manager might not realize they have the ability to remove barriers. And we might not know what's causing you trouble with it takes so long to write a capital request, or I've been waiting for this for a long time. Sometimes their boss doesn't even know it. They just assume it. I think recognizing and rewarding managers and everyone. But, one of the things I talk about, Tracy, for your listeners, think about your boss right now, if you're a listener, and let's say that while you're listening to this podcast, all of a sudden you somehow get a text, or you get a text right afterwards, and it's from your boss that says, will you call me when it's convenient? Is your first thought, oh, good, here comes reward and recognition? No, it's
right.
What did I do? What did I think? And it takes 3 positives to every 1 criticism for a person to feel good about another human being. And if you look at most organizations, when somebody talks to the manager, it's usually negative both ways. They get a little negativity, not on purpose, from the top, and then they get it from their employees. And I always go up when I do my workshops and say to man who supervises someone, and I say, have you ever had an employee come up to you and say, well, Tracy, can I talk to you for a minute? I just want to tell you, I think everybody who was supposed to come to work came to work today. The system seemed to be working. I have tools and equipment to do my job. My coworkers, what a blessing there. Everybody's working so well as a team. And the feedback you're giving me on my professional development is really appreciated. And wow, do I ever feel rewarded and recognized? A manager will say, I never get that. That's because you have to teach managers how to play offense. And what happens is if we don't go out and ask questions, we're going to play defense. So it's okay for me to say, Tracy, hey, what's going well today? Did everyone come in? Gee, how are the systems? Are they working? Yeah. Oh, great. Do you have what you need to do your job today? You're either going to get a yes or a no. So one of the things we really work on is helping create a culture where the managers are connecting enough so they hear what's right Because when you wait for somebody to come to you, it's usually going to tell you something that's wrong. And then we do a lot of exercises. We do exercises such as you start meetings out with talking about, we bring a group in and say, tell me why you are working in the field you're working in. Then they tell you, tell me why you're working where you're working at. Then they tell you. And all of a sudden it starts being positive. The other thing we do for your listeners is if you have a meeting, you have everybody at the meeting write their name on the top of a sheet of paper. And then you just start passing it around and everybody writes something positive about the person whose name's on the top of the paper. Mm-hmm. And then when they get it all done, they got this wonderful long piece of paper, depending if there's 8 or 20 or 30, of all these positive comments they have never really heard. So I know I'm going on this, but I think what happens in cultures is negativity grows naturally. Right. So we've got to really work at planting the seeds of being positive and then replenishing them so they continue to grow.
Absolutely. And you talk about just about every single one of these in your Busy Leaders handbook, and that's such a great kind of these items that are super quick. One of the things that I really loved about that is the thank you note templates that you talk about in this gratitude. As we're talking about gratitude is just appreciating individuals for who they are, and, what you just talked about in, hey, sharing with individuals what you appreciate about them. So much of that goes into what their natural strengths are. And when we look at that gratitude of an individual's natural strengths and ensuring that that's tied into the job to be done, guess what? They can bloom and be completely fulfilled in that work. And that kind of leads me to this next thing that I love that you talk about in the Busy Leaders Handbook, which is the rounding tool. And I think you probably got that from the hospital setting. But for those of us not in that setting, it's such a powerful tool. And I'd love to hear more about it.
Sure. Let me give you a little history of that. It's funny. I hadn't talked about the history of it till about a month ago. Somebody asked me, when a doctor rounds, it's very common for physicians to round. So you ask somebody when a physician rounds, why do they round? Well, they round to really check the vitals of their patient. So they sort of know we've got the patient taking this antibiotic, or we've got the patient that had this surgery. But when they round, they're checking the vitals. Well, I took that years ago and said, well, why don't we check the vitals if we're a manager on what's vital to us? So we can round on our customers, what's vital to the customer, for in a restaurant or anything like that. But we also can round on the employee. So if we want to retain, and it's interesting, Tracy, because if you look at this, all my stuff was written before the pandemic. And if there's one pain point that everybody has right now, it's we need people. Mm-hmm. And needing people is a combination. I think it's 80% retention and 20% recruitment. Now, most people think it's recruitment, but it's recruitment because you haven't done a good job with retention. So the better job you do with retention, then the more selective you can be in recruitment. So when we round on an employee, we want to be flexible. Sometimes, Tracy, people read my book and they think they got to ask it exactly like it's in my book. No, I got to know what's going on. So your husband's a respiratory therapist. If you work for me, I should know that. I'm going to know his name. I know he's in healthcare. So part of my rounding has to talk about, and what's your husband's name, Tracy?
Ryan.
Ryan. So I need to say, well, Tracy, I know Ryan's in healthcare. Tell me, how's Ryan doing? If you've got kids that are in virtual learning. So what we find is I got to let people know I care about them. The number one reason people leave their job, we've all heard this, is because it's not because of work, it's because of my boss at work. So you got to let them know I care about you as a person. Now, I'm going to judge it. You might be more into that. Somebody else might not be, but I got to know how comfortable you are. Then I got to talk about making sure that you have the right environment to work in. I can't assume you have the right environment to work in. So we're talking about rounding. We're talking about what I just mentioned. If you look at the Gallup Q12, what's important to you? Well, what's important to you is, do you have the tools and equipment to do the job? Are the systems working? Do people come in? I want to make sure everyone came in, and I need to have you help me recognize people because I'm not there all the time if I'm the manager. So I need to say, Tracy, hey, I want to be recognizing some of your coworkers. Is there anyone I can be recognizing? And you say, Diane. Well, tell me why I should recognize Diane. well, Diane did this, did that. Great. Now I see Diane. I say, Diane, I asked Tracy who I should recognize. She mentioned how it was a busy day yesterday and you stayed a little later and that caused you some challenges because you had some childcare you had to rearrange. And I just want to thank you so much for what you did. Not only does Diane like me now, but she also likes you. And then I want to make sure I call it focus, fix, and follow up. So if there's something that's not right, I want to focus on it, make sure I understand it. Then I want to try to fix it. Now, if I can't fix it, I need to tell you why I can't fix it. I just can't say, I'll look into it. I'll talk to somebody. Let me see what I can do. I need to be more specific. Then I want to fix it. Normally I can. And then you want to follow up. Now, people today are all going to say many times we need more help. And then we have to say, well, we can't really get more help. So let's talk about some things we can do. Let's talk about, are there certain things we can make easier for you? For example, in my companies, we really made asking for capital much simpler right now. You don't have to do a 3-page report. You don't have to get 3 bids because everybody's busy. If it's a vendor you've worked with in the past, just keep going. It's sometimes a trust issue. So I think rounding is the magic. And I tell people all the time, if you get rounding right, then the other stuff you'll fix a whole bunch of other things on the way. But if you don't get rounding right, so I'll go to an organization and they'll say they're rounding this level and they're going to do all sorts of other things. I say, why don't you get this up to like 90%? And then you can figure out what you need. So rounding is the magic because the way it allows a leader to play offense, not defense. Same with rounding with customers. If I wait for a customer to call me, it might not be positive. But if I call my customers, and then when I call my customers, I'm going to hear positive things too. Hey, we like to recognize people. Is there anybody that delivered? My wife had surgery last week, and, I got the names of the nurses now that I can come back. But see, they haven't called me. Now, if they'd call my wife and I and do a post-discharge phone call, which we recommend, then I would, and they say, hey, we like to recognize people here. I could have started talking to people. They could even, when I came in, said, hey, think of a restaurant. If they said, we love to recognize our staff. So as our staff's taking care of you, if you notice anybody you really like us to recognize, I'm going to come around. And if you tell me who, I'll make sure I recognize them. You will improve the service in that restaurant immediately because people know now that they're going to get recognized if they take good service and people are going to hear about it right away. So it's really building a culture of positivity or a culture of replenishment, culture of recognition, all those things.
Yeah, I love that. And we talk so much about there's really 4 kind of pillars to engaging staff. And one is they have to be in the right role. That second one is, they have to have a manager that manages them the way they need to be managed. They need to be on the team that's really executing that key strategy. And guess what? They could be great in their job, but not on the right team. And then 4th is that culture. And what you just captured with that rounding is how we can capture all 4 of those things and really key into what's so important for the team and the individual and ensuring that we're executing on the strategies of the organization and building in that gratitude, which is such an important key piece to culture. So thank you so much for that example and the tools as you've laid them out.
Well, thanks. I think the other thing you learn, Tracy, is you're either going to walk away with reward and recognition, an opportunity to coach, or a process to improve. Because I'm assuming that the employee wants to do a good job. So
absolutely.
If I'm not hearing their name, all of a sudden I'm wondering, why am I hearing 4 people, but never the 5th? So it gives me a little connection why I'm not hearing it. And that allows me to figure that out. And sometimes you have to coach it. And sometimes people you got to be real careful too, Tracy, because I'm talking about positive. You can have an employee that sucks the life out of the rest of the workplace. And you've got to be aware of that too, because, it's not bothering me, the manager, near as much as it's bothering the coworkers, because I don't have to work next to that person all the time. Right. So I know this is hard, but when you do an employee engagement survey results, if the manager's not dealing with poor performers, the employees do not think they're fair. Now, a manager doesn't think that. They'll think, well, I'm fair because I schedule fairly, my comp is fair, my benefits is fair. But to the employee, fairness means consistency of expectations and accountability. But the beauty is only about 8% of employees are in that category. But if we don't deal with that 8%, we start taking withdrawals out of that 92%.
Absolutely. And then your best people leave, right?
I remember dealing with a chief nurse officer at a hospital. They asked me one time, Quint, how do you think I am as a chief nurse officer? I said, you're good. And I think she was waiting. I thought I was going to say, you're great. And I said, you're good. She said, well, I'd want to be better than good. Well, what do you think's my biggest difficulty? I said, I don't think you can make the tough decisions on people. That's where you struggle. It's where everybody struggles. But that was hard on her because, you don't want to make mistakes. You're trying to rehab everyone. And then, Tracy, you just nailed it. One day, two of her best RNs walked into human resources and resigned because they didn't want to work with the coworker anymore because they said they're not going to sacrifice their nursing license for this coworker. The loss of those people helped her change and realize I'm not being value driven if I'm allowing low performers to stay in this organization because it's not fair to the patient, non-healthcare, not fair to the customer, but certainly it's not fair to the coworkers.
Absolutely. And we can either up-level our organizations or we're going to down-level them by not having the hard conversations. And those hard conversations are the things that are not only going to make you a better leader, but they're going to ensure that those staff are fulfilled in their work. Because if they have to pick up the slack of the others, guess what? They're going to be frustrated. And it doesn't just impact work, it impacts every single area of your life.
To talk about why people aren't good at firing. Because how do we get good at something? If you look at Malcolm Caldwell and all their work, it's by repetition. I become better by doing something over and over again. Well, if I'm a leader, I'm not going to be firing many people. I might only do it once in a while. So I'm not going to be good at it. So I think one of the things we have to realize is so for me to do something that I'm not used to doing, it's going to take a lot of preparation. It's going to take some practice. And it's not going to be comfortable. I'm not going to be good at it. And it's not going to be easy. And I think once people understand that, so the question I do, Tracy, because I think most people are very value driven, I'll ask a manager to evaluate their values on a 1 through 10, 10 being I'm very value driven. I walk the talk. I have a true north, so on. 1 is I have no idea. You're talking about cybersecurity or what? Then I asked, and I've never had anyone rank themselves less than an 8. And they're doing that because they want to be humble. They give themselves only an 8. And then I'll say, well, how good are you with performance management? Dealing with your performance issues, confronting your performance issues. And here's a 10. A 10 is, of course, we have them, but I recognize them right away. I give them feedback. I show them what right looks like. I put them on a performance plan. I coach them along the way. I give them a timeline. But if they can't meet the timeline, I remove them from the organization in a value-driven way. That's a 10. A 1 is not only do I have them, I've actually have more than one person. In fact, I have generations of low performers. That's a 1. The average score is a 5. But because they separate values and performance management into 2 different buckets. But then I say, but you can't do that because your employees don't separate them. So you have to move your values from an 8 to a 5. Most managers are so uncomfortable now because they're value driven. They will now do that tough decision, that tough call. So I think you've also got to be able to help people get through the tough times, the turbulence of it, because it's very, very difficult. And the other thing is because of lack of training, Tracy, people don't document. So about 49% of people that are considered low performers have no documentation. So we're going to keep talking and we're going to keep coming back to you've got to invest in your management team. You just can't talk about it. And most don't.
Right. They don't, and I have a quick story. And that is I was working with a leader last week and we're going through an organizational restructure. She's brand new in her HR role and her and this new CEO, executive director really just took over this organization. And guess what? We're doing an org restructure and she's going, hey, we need to make some changes. So there's 3 individuals that we kind of worked through. And this was her first time doing this. And it was the coaching that coaching back and forth. And so much of this has to do with what is my personal confidence and how do I ensure that, one, we're doing this legally compliantly. We're doing this looking at the humanity of the individual and those values of what is right for the organization, because it is an and both. And you can't separate these things into buckets like what you just talked about, and that coaching piece and the training is so incredibly important. And there's a key distinction between coaching and training, because one is it's coming at me information. The other is I'm doing it and getting feedback in the process. So I'm curious about your take on that.
I think you have to hold the person's hand because it's
absolutely
a tough thing. And I think you have to walk them through it. And I think you have to let them practice, because the performance is not going to sit here and say, you're right, I'm not doing well, I apologize, I'm changing. It's not.
Don't we wish we had that world?
they're going to play offense. They're going to blame other people. They're going to blame you. And you've got to know how to handle a very difficult situation. That's why I tell people sometimes you don't need to handle it by yourself. You can have somebody else in the room with you. Then I think the other thing is you have to create a place where they can download when it's over. That know that they're going to have this conversation at 3:00, and at 4:00, they're going to call you. They're going to have a cup of coffee. So I think like anything, the coaching comes from letting them practice. So the training comes from telling them how to do it, which is excellent. But then the coaching comes from you actually helping them do it. And I find what happens, Tracy, with coaching, we let the person explain what they're going to do instead of doing it. So I'd say, well, you're meeting with this performer. Go ahead and start the conversation. Well, I would start it like this. No. Start it like you would start it. Well, then I would say this. No, you've got to get them to really role play it. And you've got to get them so it's not the first time it's happening. So I think the coaching is helping them navigate the conversation. So when they're having the conversation, it's not like they haven't had this before. Now, it might be a few different twists, but you can prepare them for all those twists where they're going to have to say, I'd love to listen to you later, but let me finish, how to set it up. And I think the other thing is just afterwards. When I was at a hospital, we had a nurse called Sue Michaels, who was just a great leader. And she was pretty good at these conversations. So we'd always sort of match her up as a buddy system to give her support to her peers. And, she'd sort of hold their hand before it, hold their hand afterwards, because it's hard, because we know these people have children. It's just hard. It's not easy. And it's even tougher, Tracy, in a small community. Because, when I worked in Chicago and you let someone go, the odds of me ever seeing them again were slim and slimmer. If I'm in Beloit or Janesville or Rockford, I think Rockford's a little bigger. But if I'm in an area and I said, oh my gosh, my kid's on the same softball team with their kid. I'm going to see them at a Chamber of Commerce event. How am I going to handle this? So ironically, the smaller the community you live in, the more difficult these decisions are. Absolutely.
And that follow-up is key. And I have so much gratitude for you and for taking the time to chat with us today. And before we close out, we always like to ask, what is one key takeaway that you have for our CEOs and executives listening in?
Be kind to yourself, because I find what's happening is, I'm a big believer in brain health, well-being, and there's no tougher time to be a leader in an organization than right now. We're getting squeezed by supply chain. We don't have supplies here. I could build all the houses in the world, but I can't get supplies. So I think what happens, though, is they're willing to tell other people to get help. They're willing to help other people call the employee assistance program. They're willing to tell other people to get therapy, but they won't themselves. So I really try to tell CEOs, don't be afraid to make that phone call. Don't be afraid to seek out a friend or seek out therapy, and be kind to yourself, because I find life is tough enough. So we're going to get beat up no matter what. So my message is truly, you're a human being, and this is a tough environment for everyone. And don't be afraid to take care of yourself. And sometimes that means also seeking help from others. And CEOs are not good at this, because what they've been told, keep going no matter what. They've been told to be resilient, and I understand resiliency, but we've taken resiliency way beyond what it's meant to be. Resiliency doesn't mean to keep going, even if it's destroying you. Resiliency means take a breath and take care of yourself so you can continue. So my message to almost everyone, even before the pandemic, is be kind to yourself.
Thank you for that. And what's one takeaway that you have for HR professionals listening in today?
I think for HR professionals, it's really important to realize you're a support department. And as a support department, your job is to help alleviate the pain. And so you have to figure out where's the pain in your organization. I think everything we've talked about sits in the role of HR, assessing well-being. A lot of times the EAP program sits in the HR department. So what are we doing in the area of well-being? What are we doing in the area of retention? Yesterday, I talked to the company that's got 32% turnover. And my main question to them is, why are people leaving? And HR of the future is an analytic company that analyzes, I talk about, when do people leave? Why do they leave? We have to break down things like turnover to the smallest component. So I think HR has to really become, and maybe they already are, but more and more in analytics, where they're looking at the data and giving them the key data, because it's not a one size fit all. I think they can really become really good in analytics. And, I'm a huge, as you know, people person. So, they sit right next to me at the table because we want to talk about selection. Onboarding's the other thing. Southwest Airlines touches a new employee 120 times in their first year of employment. So, we know it's not just selection, it's onboarding. So human resources really can be the player that lays the foundation for the organization and be able to, I'm always so saddened that many people don't measure employee engagement, but they guess at it. And then they don't provide the training. And I am back in the healthcare business, but with my first run around, we would not work with a company that wasn't willing to commit 64 hours a year of leadership training. If you're not willing to do the training that needs to get these great results you want, then we can't work with you because you will not get those great results.
People data is so important. And we have data for financials. We have data for every other area of the business. But so often we don't have that people data in front of us. Yes. And without that people data, guess what? You're not going to be able to serve your client or your customer and really engage. And, so much of what we do has to deal with what is the people data. And let's use that people data and those metrics to ensure you have the right people in the right seat. You have the right team executing the right strategy, and that those numbers. A super quick story before we jump off, but I was working in a nursing home and I was in there 3 months, and I start looking, I'm like, hey, on this nursing home, in this shift, in this specific wing, do you realize that there has been turnover? No one in that wing on that shift has lasted more than 2 months in the last 3 years. Can you tell me why? And they're like, what do you mean our turnover isn't bad? I said, yeah, but you're looking organizationally. We need to go all the way down to the departments, into the shifts to be able to shift these. And as HR, we have to know those numbers and how they impact and relate to what the CEO and the executive team need and want so that we can be aligned. So there's my tangent for the day, Quint.
No, you're the best. I'm sitting here thinking, you've got to come help us train our company. They're very fortunate. Whoever works with you, Tracy, is very blessed to have your type of talent in the community and your type of talent available to their organization.
Thank you so much. And, so for those of you looking to learn more about Quint and the programs that he's doing, I do have linked in our show notes for today some links to some of that and your LinkedIn. There's some fabulous books, some workshops, along with the Gratitude Symposium. And I know you've got a new website that just came out on that as well.
Yeah, and that. And the other thing is, and we've invited some people too from the area. Every November, we do something called EntreCon, which is a local event for small businesses, and it covers all sorts of topics. And it's this year, of course, it's in Pensacola, but it's also virtual. And if anyone with a Beloit zip code or a Rock County zip code would like to go, if you have them contact me, I can even get them a scholarship.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the conversation and for showing that gratitude in everything that you do. Thanks for joining us. All right. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.